Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's event is the second to last in the Columbia Law School Human Rights Institute's year-long event series, 20 Years After 9/11. And today, our speakers will address the ongoing human rights crisis in Afghanistan following the US and international military force withdrawal last summer and the Taliban takeover. They will address how failures of accountability have exacerbated harm, the importance of continuing to seek accountability for war crimes and other serious abuses by all those implicated, including US forces. They will also share their recommendations on how to address the current vacuum of accountability. I'm thrilled to introduce our distinguished group of panelists today, each of who has shown deep commitment to naming human rights abuses for what they are and for pursuing accountability, even under extremely challenging circumstances and while facing significant opposition. Shaharzad Akbar is the former chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission and a leading voice on accountability for human rights abuses. Heather Barr is an associate director with the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch and a former senior Afghanistan researcher. Horia Mosadiq is an expert on transitional justice and human rights. She has held senior leadership positions at the Conflict Analysis Network and at Geneva Call. Katherine Gallagher is a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she works on universal jurisdiction and international criminal law, and has worked to open an investigation of US torture in Afghanistan before the International Criminal Court. After our speakers give opening remarks, we will have time for questions from those attending. And thank you to all of our speakers for being here today. So without further delay, let me turn over to Shaharzad to open our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Priyanka, and greetings to all. Thank you for attending this discussion on accountability in Afghanistan, and I'm very honored to be sharing this panel with colleagues, esteemed colleagues, Heather, Katherine, and Horia. I want to start by focusing on culture of impunity in Afghanistan. In the past few months since the fall of Kabul to Taliban, there has been a lot of reflection in the human rights community of Afghanistan about what went wrong. And I think personally for me, one of the big things that went wrong was the fact that there was a persistent culture of impunity and lack of accountability. When I think about the past over 20 years in Afghanistan, the three forces that really crippled our progress were culture of impunity, corruption, and conflict. And of course, they are interlinked, and culture of impunity and corruption really contributed to the conflict and to the strength of Taliban, the lack of accountability. And culture of impunity also discredited the human rights discourse in Afghanistan, because the human rights discourse in Afghanistan, the way it was introduced in the post 2001 setup, human rights was closely linked to the US and international military intervention. And in fact, the discourse about intervention was seeking some legitimacy from a narrative of saving Afghan women or bringing human rights to Afghanistan, which was, of course, not entirely true at all. It was a historic, because Afghan women had been fighting for their rights for many decades before, and there was a culture of human rights in Afghanistan prior to US intervention. But the scapegoating of the war on terror and human rights did not really serve the human rights discourse and its legitimacy, particularly when the international community led by the US then really fell short on delivering on accountability and justice. In fact, since the early days when there were discussions about justice and accountability for victims of the long-term conflict in Afghanistan that had begun decades ago, and Horia John and other colleagues would know more about this, there was a very strong demand from the Afghan human rights community at the time for a transitional justice path and for avenues to address the past and to seek accountability for victims. But all these efforts and voices were sidelined. They were, in fact, actively sidelined by both the Afghan government at the time, but also the international community. So I think this is an important point to have in mind when we talk about the failure of international intervention in Afghanistan. There is sometimes an assumption that the international intervention in Afghanistan failed because it wanted to impose human rights. The reverse is true, in my opinion. I think part of the failure is because the international intervention failed to uphold human rights and failed to walk the talk on human rights, and actually really empowered and made the culture of impunity more entrenched, and tried to use democratic means to provide opportunities for those involved in past abuses to come back to power. And what we have right now, also in the post August 15, is that ongoing culture of impunity and ongoing lack of accountability exercised by the Taliban. We have seen a horrendous trend of targeted killings, reprisals. Taliban claim that this is not an order that's coming from the leadership, that they have, quote unquote, announced public amnesty, full amnesty, regardless of them being in the position to do this or not. But we see ongoing killings, and we see illegal detentions, we see torture, and the Taliban denying them, but also not holding anyone to account on these atrocities and violations. And of course, the biggest crime, which is the crime against women as a danger, as a gender as a whole, that all the restrictions that are imposed on women on a daily basis that violate their fundamental human rights, and lack of any accountability on that issue. In instances where Taliban would like to display that there is some delivery of justice, what we have seen has been very worrying, because they hold people in detention with no due process. There are many allegations of torture with patterns that show that make it harder to dismiss these allegations across the board, as well as there are the arrests being used to silence critics and descendants. But very ironically, Taliban using a counterterrorism framework sometimes for some of these arrests, particularly the way, for instance, they targeted their own opponents in Nangarhar in Afghanistan, under the claims that they have sympathies for IS and a string of enforced disappearances, and no accountability, ongoing impunity. The message to Afghans is no one really cares for justice, no one cares for your lives as long as they're in power. So what do we have now and what the future looks like? As you all know, recently the Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan, UN Special Rapporteur for Afghanistan was appointed. And Richard Bennett has taken this position. There is a hope and expectation that this mandate will bring, again, more focus into issues of accountability. And will bring accountability again into the discussion at the UN level. Of course, the mandate has to be well-resourced for this to happen. We had been pushing for a very long time for a fact-finding mission. I do hope that the next step would be then a full-fledged fact-finding mission to actually communicate to Afghans that their demands for accountability matters and UN is taking them seriously, and the international community is fully behind it. There's also the ICC process. Katherine, I know, will speak about it. The ICC investigation in Afghanistan that's currently paused. That was another hope for accountability. But also, it was very disappointing to hear that the ICC investigation might just focus on one set of perpetrators, that is Taliban and other and terrorist groups, and that the potentially international military and Afghan security forces will be spared, while there are many well-documented instances of abuse, and there are many allegations of potentially war crimes on part of international troops, mainly US, but also others. There is the Australian investigation going on, as you might know, in terms of allegations of abuse and war crimes in Afghanistan. That's really the only solid ongoing attempt at some form of accountability. But other than that, we don't have much going on. And inside Afghanistan, of course, there has been a complete reversal of some of the small gains that we had made in this in terms of putting together a war crimes unit, the commission doing some documentation work, other civil society organizations doing some documentation work that could be then slowly start a process of victim-centered justice, where victims' issues and voices could come to the fore. And that was the hope that we had during the peace process. What can be done? It's not at all late. In fact, we haven't even taken the first step for accountability for war crimes in Afghanistan and for abuses in Afghanistan. The international community led by the US could do so much more to share information about what happens in Afghanistan, to devise mechanisms to provide reparations to victims, to ensure that there are investigations of credible allegations of abuse, and there are many, many cases that have been well documented. There has to be a continued support for Afghan-led efforts for victim-centered justice, just because supposedly the war is over, the conflict is over, which it isn't truly. We wish it were. It doesn't mean that now discussions around victim-centered justice has to take a backseat. We have very urgent human rights issues, but in the meantime, for Afghanistan to break through the cycle of conflict, we really need healing, we really need reconciliation, we really need justice, we need accountability, and we need to push for possibilities to and provide resources for documentation, for victim-led initiatives, and the Afghan human rights community, even those in exile, but also even those inside the country, still want to do something about this and want to continue documenting atrocities, but also move beyond that and really try to use universal jurisdiction and other available mechanisms to seek accountability for crimes and abuses in Afghanistan for violations of human rights. I'll stop here and I look forward to listening to everyone.
Thank you so much, Shaharzad. Heather, I'll ask you to follow.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me and organizing this. It's nice to be at a Columbia event. I'm probably about to miss my 25th anniversary. I mean, my 25th reunion. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about women's rights and how the issue of women's rights relates to accountability and transitional justice. I really agree with everything that Shaharzad said about this kind of how hollow or even fake the kind of human rights effort was over the last 20 years by the United States. But in spite of that, women's rights did thrive in some important ways, and they thrived because Afghan women's rights activists found a space and took that space. So there was a space created by the presence of the international community. There was a space created by the donor money that was available, the political pressure that the Karzai and Ghani governments were under to be somewhat respectful of women's rights, and this amazing community of women's rights activists in Afghanistan who, as Shaharzad said, were not invented in 2001. They'd been there all along. They used that space and they, really made some extraordinary progress. So on August 14th, Afghanistan had a parliament that was about 28% women, which I think is higher than the United States. It had women ministers and judges and prosecutors and soldiers and police officers and governors and all sorts of things. And another important achievement was that these women had fought really hard to create a system to deal with gender-based violence, including a 2009 law and specialized courts and prosecution units and shelters across much of the country. And so these were really, really important achievements. And also, of course, the increase in girls going to school from close to zero in 2001 to many, many millions of girls over the years was a hugely important development. And what we've seen since August 15th is that the Taliban are pretty much the same people that they were in 2001 when they lost power. The rollback of women's rights, the violation of women's rights has been pretty total. It's pretty much any area that you can think of. people will have seen that on May 23rd, the Taliban broke their promise to reopen girls' secondary schools, which they had closed for about 7.5 months. So now that closure is stretching on indefinitely, which makes Afghanistan the only country in the world that's denying girls access to education based on their gender. Women have also been banned from most forms of employment. Their freedom of movement has been cut off almost completely. They're banned from leaving the country without a male family member chaperoning them. They're banned from traveling any sort of long distance by taxi without a male family member chaperoning them. In a lot of areas, they're facing harassment just for coming out of their houses without a male family member chaperoning them, even though that's not officially the policy of the Taliban at the moment. But, there seem to be different interpretations in different places, and many of them very harsh. Women journalists have mostly had to leave their jobs, which leaves us with very little information about what's actually happening on the ground in different parts of the country. Women's access to healthcare has been cut off again by these rules about needing to have a male family member chaperoning you. This system that I described to deal with gender-based violence has been systematically destroyed by the Taliban. They've gone around and shut down the shelters. These specialized courts and prosecution units don't exist anymore. Of course, women prosecutors and judges are not able to work. So it's been a kind of, and there are many more areas I could talk about, but I have to mention also that women have been coming out and protesting against these abuses since about August 17th or 18th. And the Taliban's response has been brutal from the beginning, beating protesters, detaining and very severely injuring some journalists who covered the protests, threatening women, intimidating them, looking for activists and organizers after the protests and intimidating them and their families. But that really escalated early this year when they broke up a protest using pepper spray and electric shock, and then broke down the door of some of the protesters several days later, detained a bunch of the protesters for weeks and in abusive conditions, and then extracted forced confessions from a group of the protesters. So that's kind of a snapshot of where things are with women's rights. The international community's response has been wildly inadequate. We see lots of kind of statements condemning particularly the decision about secondary schools, but what we haven't seen is any kind of coordinated strategy to really figure out how to deal with this. And that's particularly frustrating because there are 4 countries that played a very active role in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, which also have pledged to have a feminist foreign policy. And those countries are Canada, France, Germany, and Sweden. The US, part of what has happened, I think, is that the US played such a dominant role over the last 20 years in driving the policy in the international community in Afghanistan. And then after August 15th, they seem to have just abdicated that role, leaving nobody leading. So part of what we've been trying to do is push these 4 countries that have feminist foreign policy and say to them, somebody's got to lead and it's got to be you because you've said that you're going to be a leader on defending women's rights. So there's more sort of, we've wrestled a lot with, what can actually be done and sort of brainstormed about different things, including removing the exemptions to the travel ban that restricts some Taliban leaders, because this actually seems to be the kind of thing that they really care about. They seem to care a lot about their perceived legitimacy and their overseas trips and their photo ops with diplomats and so on. So while that might seem like kind of a petty thing, I think it actually does matter to them. And then there are other things that donor countries need to do, including not worsening the really extreme humanitarian crisis, which has largely been created by decisions by donors, particularly the United States. But I just wanted to end by saying that this is all relevant to a discussion about international justice because Gender persecution is a crime against humanity, and it's a crime that hasn't been used very much. But if there was ever a situation that called for developing that jurisprudence, this is the one. And so Shaharzad's talked about the special rapporteur. We're certainly going to be looking for him to be helping to ensure that there are investigations and preservation of evidence for the kind of information that you would need to make a case about gender persecution. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Heather. You and Shaharzad have both made really clear, specific recommendations for accountability measures and moving forward. So I know that many people will welcome hearing those. Horia, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know how much I can really add up after what Shaharzad John and Heather John spoke. I just want to, highlight a couple of issues. Like when we speak about what went wrong, I think what went wrong was in 2001 in Bonn Conference, when the international community and US came with the definition of good human rights abusers and bad human rights abusers. When they came with that definition to ally themselves with the warlords who committed worst form of human rights violations and excluded the Taliban because they were fighting against the Taliban, but they were allied with the same warlords and human rights perpetrators. And what went wrong, it was in 2002 emergency law jirga when Lakhdar Ibrahimi, the UN special envoy and also head of UNAMA in Afghanistan, and also Zalmay Khalilzad, the ambassador of the US in Afghanistan, they both fought against us to make sure that the perpetrators are taking center stage in the Afghanistan's future and setting the agenda for the Afghanistan's future. And it was the time that the special envoy of the UN, Lakhdar Ibrahimi, he said, we cannot sacrifice peace for justice. So, and 22 years on, we lost the peace and we lost the justice. So what went also wrong when the amnesty law was passed in 2007 and almost everyone at the international community kept quiet about it. What went wrong when the ICC turned its back to Afghans, while for so many other situations, such as Libya, and now we are seeing in Ukraine and in so many other places where the US wanted ICC to intervene, they were so quick enough to put an investigation and even put all their forces behind the investigation and bring perpetrators to justice, while the situations such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, where the US has a blueprint and their traces of human rights violations and war crimes are so evident, they are stopping those investigations. Honestly, and then, the other blow that came to me as a human rights defender was with the United Nations, because back in 2001 and before, they put sanctions on certain members of the Taliban, senior officials, asset freeze, and so many other things, and then those sanctions were lifted. So I think I, as an Afghan, I lost my faith in all these international entities, whether it is International Criminal Court, whether it is United Nations. These are just tools in the hand of the most powerful people and most powerful countries in the world, and you're just taking, and this is such a waste of space and resources. You're simply not fit for the job anymore. For the idea that International Criminal Court, for the idea that the United Nations was created to maintain law, order, and humanity and support human rights and to stand for the rights of the victims. But unfortunately, these both entities have lost their meaning. They just became a tool in the hand of the most powerful countries. And they are just providing lip singing for what US and many other powerful countries are telling them to do. For me, as an Afghan who have lived all my life in human rights violation in a country that have been experiencing 40 years of war, my question to the United Nations is how bad I need to be to get into your sanction list and how worse I need to be to get delisted by your sanction list. I don't know what is changing in between. Or the terrorists are becoming better terrorists to get delisted? Honestly, like it's the same for the International Criminal Court. One day it was my biggest dream to join the International Criminal Court and to work on justice and investigation in Afghanistan. Now I don't desire and I don't want to be part of the International Criminal Court because this is such a puppet court. Because that court has no meaning for justice. They are not serving the victims. They are not serving the people who have been suffered. They are not serving the justice. They are serving a bunch of powerful people, powerful countries that are telling them what to do because their salaries are coming from the pockets of these powerful countries. Simply, they are not independent. And now, after 15th of August, we have saw what happened to Afghanistan. We have saw what happened to the Afghan people. We saw with the exodus that happened to the country. And now just to add insult to the injury is that, with all these prolonged processes of evacuations, resettlement, and months of uncertainty before someone can get evacuated and to get to safety. While we clearly see that this is not the situation with Ukraine. Simply our color scheme can play a role. Simply our enemy can play a role. Because USs and West's in war and they are in dispute with Russia, they would do anything to support Ukrainian. But because our enemy is no more an enemy of the West, because our enemy is now no more an enemy of the US, so they don't simply care. Unfortunately, the whole issue of human rights, democratic values, and freedom of expression, freedom of movement, anti-discrimination, this is all doesn't make any sense to me if it comes from the mouth of the same people who are putting the foundations for these discriminations, who are putting the foundation for the human rights violations, who are committing mass atrocities in countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Palestine, like Yemen, but they can still get away with it. They can get away with it so easily. So for that reason, I have, I think the only faith that I have is for the Afghan people themselves. And this is for the Afghan people themselves to stand up and to fight for their rights. And this is my only hope. And I hope that this can happen across the board. I really hope that one day the world comes to the realization that, some of these entities that were created, if they are not fit to do their job, they should be dissolved, honestly. We don't need billions of dollars to go to the entities that are not fit to do the job that they are supposed to be doing. And that includes the United Nations, and that includes the International Criminal Court.
Thank you so much for sharing those reflections, Horia. They were very powerful. And I actually read earlier this week a speech that you had given, addressing the International Criminal Court and calling on the international community, to support that effort and, the hopes of so many Afghanistans for that medium. So I think it's very powerful to hear your reflections at this juncture. And it's also a good transition to Katherine to speak about her work seeking accountability and justice through the ICC as well. So Katherine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I frankly, it's hard to follow up what Horia said. You were so powerful, so thank you for your interventions. And now to speak about the ICC and go back to a little bit more of a technical talk about this institution that has done so little for victims, despite so much effort by so many, including Horia, who I've had the real privilege to be in The Hague with through the years. it's not an easy task now to talk about the ICC, but I just want to give some background and some context to what the situation is with the International Criminal Court, historic and where we're at now, since it is still a venue that could and frankly should be providing some measure of justice and some long overdue accountability for mass criminality on the territory of Afghanistan, including the crimes that are ongoing that Heather mentioned, a large category of which is the crimes against humanity, against women and girls, the crime against humanity of persecution. So just to go back, Afghanistan joined the International Criminal Court in May 2003 as a state party. And frankly, it's pretty astounding. And I think this is thanks to individuals like we have on this call from Afghanistan who are committed to justice and the rule of law, not as rhetorical points, but as deep principles, that Afghanistan joined the court at the time that the US and was in effect there as a occupying power of sorts, and also was running CIA black site torture centers on the territory of Afghanistan. But despite that, Afghanistan decided it wanted to be part of the international community bound by the rule of law and became a state party. In 2006, the Office of the Prosecutor initiated what's called preliminary examination, the first stage towards opening an actual investigation in cases. And again, at this point, the fact that that preliminary examination was open was due largely to civil society, including Afghan civil society, and not just including, but really pushed by Afghan civil society, as well as international NGOs. Requesting that the court look at war crimes and crimes against humanity by multiple actors. So that would include not only the Taliban, that would also include Afghan national forces, and that would include international forces, primarily, but not exclusively, again, the United States. And those crimes by the international actors were the torture program, as well as drone strikes and civilian attacks that were happening on a very regular basis. It took 11 years for that preliminary examination ultimately to move to the precipice of an investigation being opened. And again, the fact, in my opinion, that the Office of the Prosecutor did move in 2017 to open an investigation was largely due to the pressure of civil society. Repeated advocacy trips by many to The Hague to meet with the Office of the Prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda and her team, and to explain, I think going back to the opening comments of Shaharzad, the cost of impunity on the ground in Afghanistan, and frankly, beyond. When you have powerful people who are able to get away with crimes, it spurs more criminality by the powerful and by those who take advantage of situations. So whether it was Putin in Georgia or Putin in Ukraine or Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories, in all of these places, that impunity that was allowed to fester and continues to fester in Afghanistan, it causes the commission of crimes in other places. So in 2017, the prosecutor put in a request to open an investigation into 3 dimensions: the crimes by the Taliban, crimes by the Afghan national forces, and crimes by the United States when it came to the torture program. And this torture program had its epicenter in Afghanistan, but it was a global torture program. And the prosecutor specifically also sought to have jurisdiction over the CIA black sites in Poland, Lithuania, and Romania. And I would just note that over 50 member states of the International Criminal Court were complicit in one way or another with that US global torture program. So this is not a small, isolated set of crimes that were being asked to be investigated by individuals like myself who represents victims of the US torture program. But again, it was getting at something deeper and more systematic. And that's that countries can disregard international humanitarian law, international human rights law at will and get away with it. And they do this most often when it's the powerful who are asking. So to move to open an investigation that was not only against the Taliban and Afghan national forces, but also against the United States, sent a message, a very powerful message, a potential message that no one is above the law, something that we hear all the time in rhetoric. There was some hope in 2017 that that would go into practice. And what we saw instead was a campaign of pressure against the ICC by the Trump administration and very, very little public support given to this investigation. No one was speaking out about how important it was to close the impunity gap, whether, again, impunity by the Taliban, impunity by the national forces, or certainly not speaking about the impunity of the United States. And so in the face of that pressure, the pretrial chamber took the unprecedented step of denying the prosecutor's request to open an investigation in 2019. Afghan victims, US torture victims pressed forward and joined with the prosecution in trying to get that reversed on appeal. And ultimately, following a hearing in 2019, there was a decision to reopen the investigation in spring of 2020. And again, that decision was met with political opposition. The Trump administration issued an executive order and ultimately put the former prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, on the sanctions list, a sanctions list that, in my opinion, often is flawed because of the way it's used in so-called counterterrorism ways. But here, to put the prosecutor of the ICC on that list was just simply astounding. It was a frontal attack on the rule of law, an attack on the independence of the court, independence of judges, independence of the prosecutor. And I will say that there were some statements in opposition, certainly from the United Nations and from some of the member states of the ASP, but ultimately not as much political pressure as you could and should expect, and also not the show of support for the ICC that could have happened and should have happened, including giving it the resources it needed to be able to do its work, to show its worth. And it was not until a number of months into the Biden administration that that executive order was rescinded and the prosecutor was taken off the list. Now, at that point, and I'm going to move quickly to close out, by that point, the Afghanistan investigation was put on hold. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, flew to Kabul right after the investigation was authorized by the appeals chamber in spring of 2020, just as the pandemic was starting. And he met with the Afghan government at that time. And the day after he left, the government of Afghanistan asked the ICC to defer the investigation, to put it on pause and let Afghanistan deal with justice and accountability. Again, there's no track record of that having been done. So between the sanctions and between the deferral request, the investigation has never actually gotten off the ground. Now, I mentioned it was 2006 that the preliminary examination started. Here we are in 2022. In 2021, as we all know, there was the takeover by the Taliban. And the following month, the new prosecutor made a move to reopen the investigation. That request was made on an urgent basis. And he also said that he would only be looking at the Taliban. So again, letting the powerful United States off the hook, it seems. But even that request to move forward with the Taliban has not moved. Here we are in April. Even when the decision came out last month to not allow girls to return to school, silence from the office of the prosecutor. There haven't been any statements. I just checked the website of the ICC, no statements, no motions, no moves by the Office of the Prosecutor to get this request to open an investigation jump-started. No urgent press releases saying, look, it's important that we look at what's happening in Afghanistan. So both the historic and the ongoing crimes, while I do believe it's of concern to the ICC, no real action is happening. And so we are still living with the situation of complete impunity. And impunity breeds repetition. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was an incredibly detailed yet succinct overview of a very long and troubling history of your work and of the attempt to get the ICC to consider abuses and crimes from Afghanistan. So some of you in your remarks addressed the novel ways in which the ICC and international mechanisms have been subjected to political pressure and used in ways that ultimately facilitated the culture of impunity that Shaharzad referred to, and that allowed these abuses to continue in repeated ways unchecked. So I want to ask a question related to, what we are seeing in current news. With the current war in Ukraine, we have seen world leaders and senior figures at international institutions, and Horia, you referred to this in your remarks as well, take very swift action to deem actions potential war crimes, to make use of international accountability routes. The ICC prosecutor almost immediately opened an investigation. We've seen, in particular, it's been striking how US leadership, including President Biden, have called for the use of these mechanisms for a trial on war crimes. We've seen news that the US is reviewing its position on the ICC. And so I wanted to ask each of you to, if you would like to comment on this, have these developments led you to see work seeking accountability for abuses in Afghanistan differently? Do you think they're harmful, or do you think they present a potential opportunity? And I don't know if there's someone who would like to address that first, but quickly I'll just ask participants. I see there's some questions in the chat, but if others would like to add, we'll address them shortly as well. Shaharzad, maybe I'll ask you to address this question first and then turn to others who would like to comment.
Thank you, Priyanka. The response to the Ukraine situation, of course, is welcome in terms of accountability, taking accountability seriously. But it's also a reminder of how politicized the issue is. We just wish to have the same response with every atrocity and every conflict. It has to, in Afghanistan, as Catherine and Horia both spoke about it, it has taken so long to move the needle on accountability with these organizations in these countries. I think I saw also some questions and comments in the chat talking about this. I really think for it to move in case of Afghanistan, yes, there can be an opportunity now that there is a focus on accountability because of the Ukraine situation, for us to bring those issues to the fore again. But for it to really move, we really need, I think, people and institutions, non-government institutions in the US to hold the US government accountable and to push on this issue. When I talk about accountability for allegations of war crimes by the US military in Afghanistan, people tell me that will never happen. The US's culture, the culture around military and protection of military, will never allow any process of independent investigation. But I refuse to believe that to be true. I do think that there are enough people in the United States or in organizations who believe in justice for all, believe in human rights for all, to actually look back at what happened in Afghanistan and think about US's role and think about US's responsibility for the current misery of Afghans, and to try to push their own institutions, look at their own military culture, and look at what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq and other parts of the world. And we can't do it without them. You know, the activists from the global south can push and push and push, but this will really require global solidarity. This will require North-South solidarity, and this will require citizens in these countries, powerful countries, to actually speak up and to push and to hold their governments to account if they truly believe that the life of an Afghan is the same value as the life of an American. So my hope is not so much on the institutions. As Horia said, we have been disappointed by the institutions many times, the formal mechanisms. My hope is really, where can we mobilize some energy in the human rights movement itself and the broader understanding of the human rights movement, including not only traditional human rights organizations, but just generally civil society organizations, associations who can come together and support these voices of victims from countries very far away from them to seek accountability and justice. Where I think it will make the biggest difference, when the most powerful are held to account.
Thank you, Shaharzad. Would any of the other speakers, Catherine, I saw you unmuted. Go ahead.
If Horia, were you going to speak? I can go after you.
Go ahead, Catherine. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's an important question, and you know, it is a difficult question to answer, because I fully agree as well. Of course, Ukraine deserves justice and accountability. I can give a quick technical answer and then maybe a broader context. The US position has been that because the United States, like Russia, like Israel, has not signed on to the ICC, its citizens can't be held to account before a court that it didn't sign up to. So from a technical standpoint, with the United States encouraging the prosecution of Russians at the ICC, that technical argument really falls flat. It would be an explicit double standard for the US now to take a different position. So I think there is a moment where we can be trying to push that forward and expose, you know, what might be a double standard, and really ensure that that doesn't get solidified in law. So it is a moment to push. It's also a moment to push for resources. The part of what the prosecutor has said is that he doesn't have sufficient resources to move forward the Afghanistan investigation in whole, maybe, but even in part at this moment. So with countries now stepping forward to offer additional resources, human and financial, to the court, this could be an opportunity to get the resources needed to move finally the investigation of Afghanistan forward. That also comes with risk, because as Horia mentioned earlier, it is the wealthy countries who then could be dictating what the agenda is for the court. I'll drop into the chat a statement put out by the Coalition for the International Criminal Court on the critical importance of ensuring that resources only go at the court level or at the prosecution level, and certainly not targeted to certain cases over others. But the last comment I would make is just to look at what happened in the United States last week with the confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And in that hearing, the fact that she represented Muslim men at Guantanamo was cited as a strike against her. There are still 37 men held without charge at Guantanamo. Everyone who went through Guantanamo and the CIA black sites and all the other US torture dungeons were Muslim men. And the fact that Guantanamo is still seen as something that needs to be protected, and that to defend the Muslim men who have been held there in violation of law for 2 decades is a strike against it, says a lot about where we are in the United States when it comes to a deep and real commitment to the rule of law and human rights. What we should be having is hearings on the US torture program and investigations that have still never happened, and on drone strikes. We shouldn't just be calling out the striking of hospitals when it's done by Russians, but looking at it when it's done by the United States. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I am deeply committed to global solidarity and moving the needle on all of this.
Thank you so much. Horia, why don't you also, I see you have your hand up, so please.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to say that what makes justice or investigation towards crimes committed by the US forces is more complicated is because US also widely used private contractors. And those private contractors were conducting all sorts of military operations on behalf of the US forces. That was from the night raids to arresting people, to torturing people, to detaining people, and to carrying people to certain other black dungeons in Eastern Europe and in some other parts of the world where people were held and tortured, and some of them were even killed. And the other challenge is also self-policing of the US forces, because what is really happening within the military culture of the US, there is no any form of accountability unless you are yourself reporting on if there are any wrongdoings, like the soldier or someone who have committed the crime or committed a human rights violation. They have to go and report it to their superiors, and or someone else need to report. And if the superior need the necessity, they would report it to the judiciary or for further investigation. If they don't see the necessity, they wouldn't report it, and then the case will be stay at that level and it will not be proceeded for further investigation. So this is, unfortunately, this culture of self-policing within the military is also another, I would say, hurdle towards any form of investigation. If those crimes are not reported within that battalion or group or whatever it is for the investigation, then there is no way that you can really find your way to find out who committed those crimes and what happened and full details of the event that happened. So these are also other flaws that need to be addressed. I don't know, I think Katherine and Heather, they may know more about this self-policing rule within the military in the US.
Thank you, Horia, for those important points. And you mentioned, Heather, there's also a question in the chat, Heather, about Cedaw. We know, we focused our conversation on specific legal mechanisms for accountability, but someone has asked, can Cedaw treaty protections offer any hope for accountability? And I know we know that accountability can take many different forms. So I think we would all be interested to hear if you have thoughts on that, as well as any response to what Horia said.
I guess just listening to the previous three speakers answering the last question, I just wanted to talk for a moment about the kind of emotional impact of what the ICC is or isn't doing. I mean, there have been several failed attempts to bring accountability in Afghanistan. There have been like 2 different efforts to kind of compile these huge documentation reports that really documented all of the abuses in a way that could be used, for various types of accountability mechanisms. Both of those reports suppressed. One of them, of course, by the US supported Afghan government. And so, people were really pinning all of their hopes on the ICC because it's all that there was left. And, there used to be these meetings, perhaps there still are, although I'd be surprised of what was called the Transitional Justice Coordination Group. And I went to those meetings for quite a while. Monthly meetings where, different activists would gather in Kabul and sort of try to strategize about what could be done about transitional justice. And everyone was always, and this is sort of in the period from, like 2011 to 2014, everyone was just waiting. Someday will the ICC act? Someday will the ICC act? And then when they finally did, when they finally opened an investigation, it was much, much, much too late, but it was still some kind of hope for people, even though the jurisdiction was only a tiny slice of the period during which Afghans have experienced serious human rights violations. But still, it felt like a tiny light at the end of the tunnel. And then this decision to focus only on the Taliban and ISKP just kind of discredits the entire process before it even starts, if it ever does. So I think it feels like kind of the death of a sort of hope that people have been carrying for so long. On Cedaw, Cedaw is a really important tool, and we use it every day and sort of talking about, I think one of the things we had to push back against, particularly at the beginning after August 15th, is people sort of viewing things through the lens of, are the Taliban better than they were last time? And, people getting, quite excited about things like, okay, this time they allow girls to go to primary school and last time they didn't. And we've had to explain over and over and over again, the standard is not whether they're better than they were in 2001 in some small incremental ways, or less abusive than they were in 2001. The standard is Cedaw. And under Cedaw, they, like every other government that's ratified Cedaw, as Afghanistan did in 2003, are obliged to ensure full gender equality in all aspects of society. The enforcement mechanisms for conventions like Cedaw are not the same as prosecutions, obviously. You might get asked some pretty tough questions by a committee, which will then write a report saying some pretty tough things about you. But those mechanisms do make a difference. They do matter over time. And I think one of the things that we all have to do, in the ways Catherine's talked about, how we need to support the ICC and the functioning and the resources and the legitimacy of the ICC. We need to also support the functioning and legitimacy of these mechanisms for monitoring treaties like Cedaw, and make sure that those committees are taken seriously, because it should be a way to focus the world on just how extreme the abuses against women are in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for framing the emotional impact of seeing what has happened with the ICC and how it has impacted those, both the Afghan human rights community and those who have worked for human rights in Afghan for so very long. I think we can only imagine how difficult it must be to see things that you have worked so hard for in this context being achieved so quickly and with so much support in a different context. We're coming where we've actually reached the end of our time together today, and it feels far too short. I really want to thank all of you for giving us your time and sharing your expertise and your deep experience on these issues with our participants today. I know that I personally learned so much and will likely return to the recording of this talk to catch things I may have missed the first time. And for all of you who are joining us, this talk will be available after the fact on YouTube. Again, it's our second to last event in our post 9/11 speaker series. We'll have one more towards the end of the month. So please sign up for the Human Rights Institute's mailing list and look for news on that as well. But with that, I just want to thank Shaharzad, Heather, Horia, and Catherine so much for your time today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.